There was a house on the corner of a street in Charlotte, North Carolina, that stood for 81 years before anybody outside the family ever knew its story. Wood siding painted the color of buttermilk, a porch swing that 4 generations of children learned to fall asleep on, and a deed folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth that named a man who had been born enslaved as the first owner of that piece of ground. Family, that house is still standing. But most houses like it are not. Most families never got the chance to fold a deed until the paper wore thin. And what I want to talk to you about today is not just about houses. It's about the difference between a family that gets to build something that lasts and a family that has to start over. Start over every generation, every single time. Hey family, I'm James, and today we're going somewhere a little different than usual. We're not talking about a recipe today, or a Sunday dinner, or a hymn your grandmother used to hum while she ironed. Today we're talking about something that shaped every single one of those things without you ever quite seeing it. The ground under the house. The economics of black homeownership in America. Where it started, what stood in the way of it, and what it still looks like today. Now, before we get into it, if you're new here, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're building something here, a place where we tell the truth about where we came from. All of it, the parts that hurt and the parts that make you proud. So go on, hit subscribe, and let's get into this together. Right now, today, if you drove down any street in this country, you'd find something true whether you could see it or not. A white family living on that street is more likely to own that home than a black family living 3 streets over. Not by a little, by a lot. Something like 70-some out of every 100 white families own the roof over their heads. For black families, it's closer to 40-some out of 100. That gap has not moved much in my lifetime, family. It has not moved much in my daddy's lifetime either. And when you follow that gap all the way down to its root, you don't find laziness. You don't find bad decisions. You find paperwork. You find maps. You find rules that were written on purpose by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and you find a system that quietly kept doing its work long after anybody admitted it was still working at all. See, wealth in this country was never really about a paycheck. A paycheck comes and goes. Wealth is about what you can hand down. And for most American families, the biggest thing they ever hand down is a house, not stocks, not some inheritance from an uncle in the family business. A house, the one that got paid off over 30 years, the one that doubled in value while the family lived their whole lives inside it. That house becomes the down payment for the next generation's house. It becomes the college tuition. It becomes the cushion when somebody loses a job or gets sick. A house isn't just shelter, family. A house is a machine that makes more security, generation after generation, quietly, in the background, while everybody's just living their lives. Now hold that thought, and let's go back. Let's go all the way back to right after the war ended. Not the ones you're thinking of. I'm talking about the Civil War, 1865. There was a promise floating around back then. One you might have heard your granddaddy mention. 40 acres and a mule. Land that had been worked by enslaved hands for 200 years. Finally, for one brief shining moment, about to be handed back to the people who built this country's wealth with their backs and never saw a dime of it. Family, that promise didn't last a year. It got reversed. The land went back to the very men who had owned human beings on it, and just like that, the first real chance at black land ownership in this country closed before it ever opened. But folks didn't quit. That's the part I need you to understand before we go any further. Even with the door slammed in their face, black families in the South scraped, saved, and sacrificed. And by the early 1900s, against odds you and I can barely imagine, black Americans had accumulated millions of acres of land, farms, homesteads, whole communities built brick by brick with hands that had once built for somebody else, and were now, finally, building for themselves. There were towns, whole town, where black families owned the general store, the bank, the doctor's office, the theater. You've probably heard the name of one of them, Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma. They called it Black Wall Street, and it wasn't a nickname somebody made up to be cute. It was a working, thriving, self-sufficient black economy, with homeowners and business owners passing down real, tangible, growing wealth. And in 1921, over the course of about 18 hours, it was burned to the ground. Family, I'm not going to sit here and relitigate every detail of what happened in Tulsa. You can find the history, and I encourage you to go read it for yourself, all of it, because it deserves more than I can give it in this video. What I need you to sit with is simpler than that. An entire generation's worth of home ownership, business ownership, land ownership, gone. Not gradually, not through some slow economic downturn. Gone in a single night, and none of it was ever repaid, none of it was ever rebuilt to what it had been. And Tulsa was not the only one. It was the most famous, but it was not alone. Across this country, thriving black landowning communities were destroyed, driven out, or swindled out of what they'd built, over and over, in ways that rarely made the history books your children were handed in school. Now, let's keep moving forward, because the story doesn't stop there. It just changes shape. In the 1930s, this country went through the Great Depression, and the federal government, trying to keep the whole economy from collapsing, created new home loan programs to help families buy houses. Sounds good on the surface, doesn't it? But here's what they did, and I want you to really hear this part. The government created maps, actual maps, of cities all across this country, and they colored in neighborhoods by how safe they considered them for a loan. Green meant safe, blue meant still pretty good, yellow meant declining, and red meant hazardous, too risky to lend to. And family, if a neighborhood had black families living in it, didn't matter if those families were doctors, teachers, preachers, business owners, didn't matter one bit. That neighborhood got colored red, every time. That's where the word redlining comes from. It wasn't a figure of speech. It was drawn in red ink on real maps by real government employees, and banks used those maps for decades to decide who got a loan and who didn't. So, while white families all across this country were getting affordable, government-backed loans to buy homes in growing suburbs, homes that would go on to gain value for 50, 60, 70 years. Black families, no matter their income, no matter their credit, were locked out of that same system almost entirely. And here's the part that gets me every time I think about it: family. This wasn't some accident. This wasn't some unfortunate byproduct of a system that just happened to work out that way. It was written down. It was policy. The very same federal underwriting manual that helped build the American middle class specifically instructed against lending in neighborhoods where black families lived, because it considered their presence a threat to property values. Think about what that does to a man's spirit, working hard, saving every dollar he can, doing everything right, and being told, in ink, that his very presence made a neighborhood less valuable. Now, around this same time, there was another program that gets talked about like it was pure blessing for this whole country. And in a lot of ways it was. The GI Bill, 1944. Millions of soldiers coming home from World War II, and the government offering them low-interest home loans, tuition assistance, a real shot at climbing into the middle class. And I want to be fair here. Family. That bill, on paper, applied to every soldier, black or white. But here's what they don't tell you in the textbook version. That bill was administered locally, which meant, in practice, a black veteran who had gone overseas, who had fought and bled for this country same as any white soldier standing next to him, came home and walked into a bank that simply refused to process his loan, came home and found real estate agents who wouldn't show him a house outside of a handful of designated neighborhoods, came home a hero on paper, and a man who still couldn't buy a house in most of this country in practice. My own granddaddy used to talk about a man he served with. Both of them came home from the war the same year. Both of them went down to apply for that GI loan. One of them walked out with the keys to a brand new house in a brand new suburb within about 6 weeks. The other one, my granddaddy's friend, got turned away 3 separate times before he gave up and rented the rest of his life. Same uniform, same war, same paperwork, practically. 2 completely different futures, and neither one of them ever really talked about why, because by then, everybody already knew why. Didn't need to be said out loud. Now, before we keep going deeper into this, and family, we're about to go deeper, I want to hear from you. Somewhere out there watching this video, there's somebody whose grandfather or great-grandfather was the very first person in your family to own a piece of land or a house free and clear. I want you to tell me about them in the comments. What did they do to make it happen? What did they have to overcome? What did that house or that land mean to your family once they finally got it? I read every single comment on these videos, and I promise you, Somebody else watching needs to hear that story as much as I do. Now, let me pause for just a moment because there's something I keep coming back to as I put together stories like this one. Just like the recipe your big mama never wrote down, the one you've been chasing the taste of your whole life and can't quite get right. The story of how she saved and scraped and figured out a way to buy that little piece of land, that story never got written down either. Most of what our families built, they built without leaving a paper trail behind for us to follow. The wisdom just lived in them, and when they passed, so much of it went with them. That's exactly why I put together something called the Soul Roots Cookbook. 100 forgotten Black American recipes, written out the way Big Mama would have made them. Complete, patient, and true. The same way she'd want you to have them. Because whether it's a recipe or a piece of land, the instinct is the same. We don't want to lose what they worked so hard to give us. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments below. You can also scan the code on your screen right now if that's easier. Don't let what's left of it slip away too. All right, family, let's keep going because there's more to this story, and it doesn't get any lighter before it gets better. Even when a Black family did manage to find a bank willing to lend, or scraped enough together to buy a home outright with cash, there was still another wall waiting. Restrictive covenants. These were clauses written directly into property deeds, legal, binding, enforceable in court, that said a home could never be sold to a Black family no matter what. Entire subdivisions across this country, from Chicago to Los Angeles to right here in the South, had this language baked into every single deed. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't whispered, it was typed out in the paperwork, plain as day, right alongside the property lines and the square footage. It took until 1948 for the Supreme Court to even say those covenants couldn't be enforced by the courts anymore. 1948, family. Think about how many generations of families had already bought, built, and passed down wealth in neighborhoods that were legally sealed off before that ruling ever came down. And even after that ruling, the practice didn't just disappear because a judge said so, it shapeshifted. Real estate agents started something called blockbusting, going into a white neighborhood, convincing families their property values were about to crash because a Black family was moving in nearby, buying up those houses at a discount out of fear, then turning around and selling those same houses to Black families at inflated prices, sometimes on predatory contracts instead of normal mortgages. A contract sale where, if you missed even one payment after years of paying faithfully, you could lose the house entirely and every dollar you'd already put into it, with no equity, no ownership, nothing to show for years of sacrifice. Whole neighborhoods in cities like Chicago were built on exactly this practice, and family, some of the folks who lived through it, are still alive today to tell you about it themselves, if you know where to look and who to ask. So by the time the Fair Housing Act finally passed in 1968, outlawing this kind of discrimination once and for all, at least on paper, this country had already spent more than 3 decades building white wealth through homeownership, while systematically blocking Black families from that same door. And here's what I need you to understand about wealth, family, because this is the heart of everything I'm telling you today. Wealth compounds. It doesn't just sit there. A house bought in 1950 for $8,000 in a neighborhood that was allowed to appreciate freely for 70 years might be worth $500,000 or more today. That's not just a house anymore. That's inheritance. That's a down payment for 3 grandchildren. That's a college fund. That's the difference between one generation struggling to make rent and the next generation starting out already ahead. When you lock a whole community out of that system for generations, you're not just taking a house away. You're taking away every single thing that house would have grown into over the next 100 years. That's why, family, when people ask why the wealth gap between Black and white families in this country is still so wide today, and it is wide, wider than most folks realize, the answer isn't about who worked harder or who saved smarter. Study after study has shown the same thing. For every dollar of wealth held by the typical white family in this country, the typical Black family holds somewhere around a dime on the dollar. And the single biggest reason for that gap, more than any other factor, comes back to one thing: home equity. Who was allowed to build it, who wasn't, and how long the head start has had to grow. Now I know some of you watching this are thinking about your own family right now, thinking about the house you grew up in, and whether your people ever really owned it, or whether they rented their whole lives because the door just never opened for them, the way it opened for somebody else. And if that's you, family, I want you to hear me clearly. That is not a reflection of what your people were capable of. Every single obstacle I just described was built on purpose by people who had the power to build it. Your grandmother wasn't behind. She was blocked. Your granddaddy wasn't lacking ambition. He was locked out of rooms he had every right to walk into. I need you to carry that distinction with you because it matters. It matters for how you see them, and it matters for how you see yourself. Now, let's talk for a minute about the families who found a way through anyway. Because they did. All across this country, against every single obstacle I've just laid out, Black families found a way to own something. Sometimes it was through Black-owned banks and lending institutions. And family, there were more of these than most people ever learn about. Institutions built by Black communities specifically because they'd been shut out of the white ones, pooling their own money to lend to their own neighbors when nobody else would. Sometimes it was through sheer stubborn saving, cash paid in full, dollar by dollar, over 10 or 15 years, just to avoid ever having to ask a white bank for permission. Sometimes it was through church congregations pooling resources together to help a family in the congregation make a down payment. And sometimes, family, it was simply through refusing to give up after the third, fourth, fifth door got closed in their face. If this is bringing something up for you, go ahead and hit that like button right now. And subscribe if you haven't already, because we've got a lot more of these stories waiting. And while you're at it, family, drop a comment for me. Tell me the neighborhood your family finally settled in, the one that became home for good. I want to know its name. I want to know what it looked like when your people first got there. I think about a woman I heard about once. Not somebody famous, just somebody whose story got passed down the way these stories do, mother to daughter to granddaughter, who worked as a domestic for a white family 6 days a week for the better part of 20 years, and every single payday, she put a little bit of that money into a coffee can on the top shelf of her kitchen. Not a bank account, a coffee can, because she didn't trust the banks in her town not to find some reason to turn her away, and she wasn't about to give them the chance. 20 years, family. 20 years of coffee cans, and one day she walked into a small Black-owned lending office 2 counties over, laid every dollar of that savings on the counter, and bought a house outright, in cash, at 51 years old. Her granddaughter still lives in that house today, still keeps an empty coffee can on the same shelf, just to remember. That's the piece of this whole story that never makes it into the textbooks, family. Not just what was taken, what was built anyway, in spite of everything. Now, before I bring this one home, I want to say something plainly because I think it matters. I know some of you carry a heaviness listening to a story like this one. I know it might stir something up, some anger, some grief, some questions about why things ever had to be this way. I'm not going to tell you not to feel that. Feel it. But I also want you to feel something else right alongside it, and that's pride. Because in spite of maps colored in red ink, in spite of clauses buried in deeds, in spite of loans denied and doors closed and whole neighborhoods burned to the ground, this community kept building, kept saving, kept passing down whatever it could, however small, so the next generation would have a little more than the last one did. That, to me, family, is the real story underneath all of this. Not just what was done to us, what we did anyway. You've been with me through most of this video now, and I want to tell you something real quick before we finish up, because I don't say this in every video, and I mean it when I do say it. So many of the families I've told you about today, the ones who saved for 20 years in a coffee can, the ones who built whole towns like Greenwood from nothing, the ones who scraped together a down payment through a church collection plate, none of that ever got written down anywhere official. It lived in memory, in stories told at kitchen tables, and when the folks who lived it passed on, so much of that memory went right along with them. I built the Soul Roots cookbook because I don't want that same thing to keep happening to the recipes, the traditions, the 100 pieces of who we are that our grandmothers carried and never got the chance to write down themselves. 100 recipes, complete, the way Big Mama made them, with every one of her tips and secrets included. You can keep relying on memory alone, the way so much of our history already has been. Or you can have it all in one place, preserved properly, starting today. The link's in the description and pinned in the comments. Scan the code on your screen if that's quicker for you. I did my part putting it together. The rest, family, is yours. Family, this house we've been talking about today. It was never really just about wood and brick and a mortgage payment. It was about proof. Proof that you belong somewhere. Proof that after everything you could still build something that would outlast you. That's why losing it, or never getting the chance at it, cut so deep for so many families in this community. And that's why the families who did get it held onto it like their life depended on it. Because in a lot of ways, it did. I think about that coffee can again. About that 81-year-old house down in Charlotte with the porch swing 4 generations fell asleep on. About my granddaddy's friend who came home a war hero and still couldn't get a loan. About Greenwood, burning. About a grandmother who colored in a map with red ink and never had to look a single black family in the eye while she did it. All of it lives inside this one story, family, whether you ever learned it in a classroom or not. Share this one with somebody in your family who still has questions about why Grandma and Grandpa's house means as much as it does. Somebody who's never quite understood why the deed to that house sits in a lockbox instead of a drawer. This might be the video that finally explains it to them. Subscribe, because next time we're going somewhere just as real as we went today. This community has always known how to build something out of almost nothing. I'll see you next time, family.